The summer air hung heavy, smell of motor oil and rust as Tiffany Clark's Honda Civic idled outside Warehouse 47 on the corner of Industrial Boulevard and the 23-year-old accountant clutched her purse tighter, checking her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. She was supposed to meet her contact at midnight, someone who claimed to have information about discrepancy she'd discovered in her employer's books. Meridian Construction Company had been her first real job after college, and Tiffany took pride. But 3 weeks earlier, she'd stumbled across something that made her stomach turn. Invoices for materials that were never delivered, payments to shell companies, disturbing of all, what appeared to be money laundering through construction projects Pacific Northwest. The streetlight above flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across the empty lot. Industrial Boulevard stretched dark in both directions, flanked by shuttered warehouse and loading dock. The only sounds were the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional rattle of freight trains in the rail yard beyond the chain-link fence. Tiffany had debated bringing someone with her, but the anonymous caller had been explicit. Come alone, or the information died with him. She'd left a note in her apartment, sealed in an envelope and hidden behind her bedroom dresser, detailing everything discovered. If something happened to her, at least the truth survived. At 11:50 p.m., headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. A black sedan pulled up 20 feet behind her, engine running. Through the glare, she could make out two silhouettes in the front. Neither got out. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited, the minutes stretching like hours. The passenger door of the sedan finally opened, and a tall man in a dark jacket emerged. He walked with purpose toward her car, his face obscured by shadows. Tiffany rolled down her window halfway as he approached, keeping the engine running. "You're early," the man said, his voice gravelly and unfamiliar. "Are you the one who called me?" Tiffany asked, and trying to keep her voice steady. "Get out of the car. We need to talk where it's more private." Something in his tone made her grip the steering wheel tighter. "I'm fine here. Just tell me what you know about Meridian." The man glanced back toward the sedan, then leaned closer to her window. "Look, lady, what you've stumbled onto is bigger than some construction company cooking book. You're in danger sitting out here in the open. There's a place inside the warehouse where we can talk safely." Tiffany's instincts screamed at her to drive away, but the promise of answers was too strong. She'd already come this far, risked this much. 5 minutes, she said, turning off the engine. The warehouse's side door was already propped open, spilling a rectangle of pale light onto the cracked asphalt. As they walked toward it, Tiffany noticed fresh tire tracks in the oil-stained gravel. Multiple vehicles had been here recently. The man gestured for her to go first, and as she stepped through the doorway, she realized her mistake. The warehouse was empty. At least 6 men stood waiting in the shadows, and none of them looked like concerned citizens with information. The man behind her pushed the door closed, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. "A gunshot." "Tiffany Clark," said a voice in the darkness. A well-dressed man in his 50s stepped into the light, flanked by 2 others. "You've been asking the wrong questions to the wrong people." Back toward the door, but the man who'd led her inside was already blocking her. "I don't know what you're talking about. I just came here because someone said they had information about Meridian Construction, about certain financial irregularities." The older man smiled, but it never reached. "Yes, we know exactly you're here. The question is what we're going to do about it." Tiffany's mind raced. These weren't whistleblowers, concerned citizens. These were the people she'd been investigating. Somehow they'd turned her own search for truth into a trap. "My boyfriend knows where I am if I don't come home." "Ms. Clark, you told your roommate you were visiting your sister in Salem. Your sister hasn't heard from you in 2 weeks, and your boyfriend is working a night shift at the hospital until 7 a.m. The man's smile widened. "We've done our homework." The walls of the warehouse seemed to close in around her as the full scope of her situation became clear. She'd walked into something far more dangerous than simple embezzlement, and now she was completely at their mercy in a place where no one would think to look for. The last thing Tiffany Clark saw before the lights went out was the concerned expression on the face of Detective Ray Morrison, whose photograph she'd glimpsed in one of the men's jacket pockets. She didn't know it then, but Morrison was supposed to be one of the good guys. Detective Sarah Chen stared at the Honda Civic sitting in the impound lot, its doors wide open and contents scattered across the front seat. The call had come in at 6:47 a.m. from a warehouse security who'd noticed the abandoned vehicle during his morning round. The car's registration led them to Tiffany Clark, a 23-year-old accountant with no criminal record and no apparent reason to disappear. Purse is still here, keys in the ignition, wallet intact with cash cash and credit cards, reported Officer Martin, reading from his initial assessment. No signs of struggle inside the vehicle, but the driver's seat is adjusted for someone shorter than the registered owner. Chen crouched beside the driver's door, noting the position of the seat and mirrors. Tiffany's DMV photo showed a woman about 5'6", but the seat was pushed forward for someone several inches shorter. Either someone else had been driving, or Tiffany had been forced to adjust her position. Any witnesses? Chen asked, though she already expected the answer. Industrial Boulevard was a ghost town after 10 p.m., especially on weeknights. One of the freight workers thinks he saw headlights around midnight, but he was loading containers and didn't pay much attention. Security cameras on the warehouse are either broken or pointed the wrong way. Detective Ray Morrison approached from across the lot, his usual swagger more pronounced than Chen remembered. She'd worked with Morrison for 3 years and always found him competent, if occasionally cutting corners. But something about his demeanor this morning seemed off. Missing person report came in about an hour ago, Morrison announced, waving a piece of paper. Roommate called when Clark didn't come home. Says she was supposed to meet someone last night, but didn't say who. Chen studied her partner's face carefully. The roommate have any idea what this meeting was about? Claims she doesn't know. Says Clark had been acting nervous lately, spending a lot of time on work stuff after hours. Morrison shrugged. Could be she got mixed up with the wrong crowd. Maybe drugs, gambling debts. 23-year-old accountant with no record gets involved with dealers serious enough to make her disappear? Chen shook her head. Something doesn't add up. They spent the next hour combing through the Civic for evidence. Chen found a small notebook wedged under the passenger seat, filled with what appeared to be financial calculations and company name. Most of the entries were innocuous, but several pages contained question marks next to large dollar amounts and references to MCF and shell payment. MCF, Chen mused, could be initials or an abbreviation for something. Morrison glanced over her shoulder at the note. Probably work note. Accountants write down everything. His dismissive tone struck Chen as odd, but she made a mental note to follow up on the note's content. The forensics team arrived at 10:15 a.m., led by senior technician David Park. Chen had worked with Park on dozens of cases and trusted his thorough approach. As his team processed the vehicle for fingerprint trace evidence, he walked the perimeter of the area where the gun found. The warehouse district stretched for several blocks, a maze of identical concrete buildings and empty lot. Most of the businesses were shipping companies, auto repair shops, and storage facilities. The kind of place where someone could disappear without attracting attention. Detective Chen? Park, you need to see this. He pointed to a small smear of what looked like blood on the driver's door handle, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It's been wiped, but not completely. I'll need to run tests to confirm it's human, but the preliminary field test is positive. Chen felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with realizing a missing person case might be something much worse. How much blood are we talking about? Not enough for a major injury, but definitely more than you'd get from a paper cut. Could be from a struggle, or maybe someone got hurt during whatever happened here. Morrison moved closer to examine the blood smear, but his expression remained neutral. Could be from anything. Maybe she cut herself on something. Ray, look around. What sharp objects do you see? Chen gestured at the empty lot. And why would she wipe it off if it was just an accident? As the forensics team continued processing the scene, Chen interviewed the warehouse security guard who'd found the car. Harold Vance was 62, a retired longshoreman who'd been working security for years. He walked her through his routine, explaining how he'd noticed the Honda because it wasn't supposed to be there. Lot's supposed to be empty after hours, Vance explained. Sometimes you get kids parking here to drink or whatever, but they don't usually leave their cars. This one had me worried because the door was open, like someone left in a hurry. Hopi, you notice any other vehicles in the area last night? Vance beard. Well, there was that black sedan parked over by Warehouse 40 around midnight. Thought it was strange because that building's been empty for months. Chen's pulse quickened. You get a look at the license plate or the people inside? Too dark, and I didn't want to get too close, but I seen that car before. Maybe 2 or 3 times in the past month. Always late at night, always. After finishing with Vance, Chen tried to reach Tiffany's roommate, Lisa Park, but got no answer. She left messages at both the apartment and Lisa's workplace, then headed back to the precinct to start building a timeline of Tiffany's last known movement. The missing person report painted a picture of a responsible young woman with no history of erratic behavior. Tiffany worked regular hours, paid her bills on time, and maintained close relationships with family and friends. Her disappearance was completely out of character. character. But as Chen dug deeper into Tiffany's background, one detail stood out. She worked for Meridian Construction, and according to her employment file, she'd recently been promoted to senior accountant with access to all financial. Chen made a note to visit Meridian first thing the next morning. Something told her that whatever had happened to Tiffany Clark, the answers lay in those financial records she'd been so carefully analyzing. June 17, 1994, 9:15 a.m. Meridian Construction Company, Southeast Portland. The offices of Meridian Construction occupied the top 2 floors of a modest brick building on Division Street. Chen arrived early, hoping to catch employees where they'd had time to coordinate the stories about Tiffany Clark's disappearance. The receptionist, a nervous woman in her 40s named Beth Harrison, confirmed that Tiffany hadn't shown up for work yesterday and hadn't called in sick. "It's not like her at all," Harris insisted. "Tiffany's the most reliable person we have. Even when she had the flu last winter, she called in 2 hours early to make sure her work got covered." Chen was led to a small conference where she met with Meridian's owner, Frank Castellano, and his operations manager, Pete Russo. Both men expressed concern about their missing employee, but Chen detected an undercurrent of tension he couldn't quite identify. "Tiffany was an exemplary employee," Castellano, his hands carefully on the table. "Dedicated, thorough, never any problems. This disappearance is completely inexplicable." Russo nodded in agreement. "She was working on some year-end reconciliation projects, staying late some evenings to catch up. Maybe the stress got to her?" Chen took notes, observing their body language. "What kind of projects was she working on specifically?" "Standard stuff," Russo replied quickly. "Accounts payable, receivables, making sure our books balanced for the quarterly reports. I'd like to see her work area and any files she was reviewing recently." The 2 men exchanged glances before Castellano nodded. "Of course, whatever you need to find our Tiffany." Tiffany's desk was neat and organized, several manila folders stacked in her inbox, a computer terminal that required a password to access. Chen made note of the file name: Q1 disbursement, vendor payments, April, and project allocations, Richmond Development. "Can someone help me access her computer files?" Chen asked. Russo stepped forward. "I'll need to get our IT guy to reset her password. Might take a day or 2. Chen found it interesting that a small construction company would need 2 days to reset a password, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she asked to speak with Tiffany's co-workers individually. The first interview was with Jennifer Walsh, a junior accountant who worked closely with Tiffany. Walsh seemed genuinely distressed about her colleague's disappearance, and her account painted a picture of someone who'd been increasingly troubled in recent weeks. "She was staying really late, going through old files and asking weird questions," Walsh explained. "Like, she wanted to see invoices from vendors I'd never heard of, and she was cross-referencing payments with project timelines that didn't make sense." "What kind of question?" "Well, she asked me if I knew anything about something called Pacific Northwest Material. When I said no, she showed me these invoices for like $2 million worth of concrete and steel that supposedly went to our Richmond project, but I drive past Richmond every day on my way home, and there's no way they used that much material." Chen leaned forward. "Did she share her concerns with anyone in management?" "That's the thing. She was being really secretive. She made me promise not to mention to anyone, said she needed to be sure before she raised any red." After the interview, Chen asked to see the files. Walsh was told they were locked in Tiffany's and no one. Another convenient delay. Her next interview was with Maria Santo, the office manager, who provided additional detail about Tiffany. She'd been asking for access to older file stuff from 2 or 3 years back, and she wanted copies of our vendor registration paperwork, which seemed odd for someone working on current accounts. "Did she say why she needed the older files?" "She said she was trying to establish payment patterns for some kind of efficiency analysis Mr. Castellano had but when I asked Mr. Castellano about it, he didn't know what I was talking about." Chen made a mental note to confront Castellano about this discrepancy, but first she wanted to get a look at Tiffany's apartment to see if she'd taken any work files home. The drive to Tiffany's apartment took her through a residential neighborhood, small craftsman houses, tree-lined. The duplex S.E. Horn Boulevard was well-maintained, small garden, and a red bicycle to the front porch. Lisa Park, Tiffany's roommate, was finally available and eager to. A graduate student in psychology at Portland State, she'd lived with Tiffany for 18 months and considered her a close friend. "She's been really stressed about work lately," Lisa confirmed, leading Chen to Tiffany's bedroom. She'd come home with these spreadsheets and spend hours going through them with a calculator and highlighting different entries. The bedroom was as organized as Tiffany's desk, but Chen immediately noticed a filing cabinet in the corner that looked out of place in a personal space. The top drawer was locked, but Lisa had a key. She asked me to hold on to this in case anything happened to her, handing over. She said it was just work stuff, but she wanted to make sure safe. Inside the filing cabinet, Chen found photocopies of dozens of invoices, payment authorizations, and vendor agreements. Many were highlighted and annotated in Tiffany's neat handwriting. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Systematic overpayments to shell companies, fake invoices for materials never delivered, and a web of financial relationships that seemed designed to obscure the movement of money. One folder was labeled MCF Connection and contained a hand-drawn organizational chart showing relationship between Meridian Construction, several shell companies, and what appeared to be a broader network of businesses involved in money laundering. At the bottom of the filing cabinet was a sealed envelope Tiffany had hidden behind her dresser, addressed to whoever finds this. Chen opened it with growing concern. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me," the letter began. "I've discovered that my employer, Meridian Construction, is part of a money laundering operation that involves millions of dollars and reaches into city government and law enforcement. I have documented evidence of the scheme, but I'm afraid to go to the police because I don't know who can be trusted." The letter went on to detail specific names, dates, and amounts, painting a picture of corruption in Chen's stomach. According to Tiffany's research, Meridian was just one node in a network that included city council members, building inspectors, and at least one police detective. The name that made Chen's blood run cold was the last one on the list. Detective Ray Morrison, her own partner, identified as MCF Enforcement, a note that he'd been seen meeting with Frank Castellano on multiple. Chen sat on Tiffany's bed, staring at the letter and trying to process its implications. If Tiffany was right, then her own partner might be involved in her disappearance. And if Morrison was compromised, who else in the department could be trusted? June 18th, 1994, 7:45 a.m. Chen's apartment, southeast Portland. Sarah Chen barely slept after discovering Tiffany's letter. She'd driven home with the evidence files hidden in her trunk, afraid to bring them into the precinct where Morrison might see. Now, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee growing cold, she tried to decide who she could trust with what she'd learned. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Tiffany had documented a pattern of financial irregularities that pointed to systematic money laundering through construction projects. But more troubling were the photographs tucked into the back of the MCF file. Surveillance shots of Morrison meeting with Frank Castellano outside a restaurant, Morrison entering the same warehouse district where Tiffany's car was found, and Morrison accepting what appeared to be an envelope from someone Chen didn't recognize. Her phone rang at 8:15, Morrison's voice on the other end. "Chen, where are you? We've got a development in the Clark case." "What kind of development?" "Anonymous tip came in overnight. Someone called the hotline claiming they saw a woman matching Clark's description getting into a blue pickup truck on Industrial Boulevard around midnight on the 15th. Might be our break." Chen felt a chill run down her spine. The timing was too convenient, coming just after she'd discovered evidence linking Morrison to the case. "I'll be right there." At the precinct, Morrison seemed unusually eager to follow up on the anonymous tip. He'd already pulled DMV records for blue pickup trucks registered in the Portland area and identified several potentials. "This guy looks promising," Morrison, pointing to a mugshot. "Tommy Nguyen, 34, multiple arrests for assault and drug possession, drives a blue Ford pickup, lives about 6 blocks from where Clark's car was found." Chen studied the Nguyen looked like a small-time criminal, exactly the kind of person who might be used as a patsy in a larger scheme. "Have we verified he owns the truck?" "Working on it. I figured we could pay him a visit this morning, see if his story holds up." As they drove toward Nguyen's address, Chen watched Morrison carefully. His behavior seemed normal, but she noticed he'd chosen a route that took them past Meridian Construction's office. When she mentioned it, he claimed he wanted to get a feel for the area. Nguyen lived in a rundown apartment complex near the rail yards. They found him nursing a hangover and claiming he'd spent the night of June 15th at a bar across town. He had receipts and witnesses to back up his alibi, but Morrison seemed reluctant to accept the evidence. "Receipts can be faked," Morrison insisted, as they left the apartment, and his bar buddies aren't exactly reliable witnesses. Chen was beginning to see the pattern. Morrison wanted Nguyen to be guilty, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Someone needed a scapegoat, and a small-time criminal with a record was perfect. Back at the precinct, Chen made an excuse to visit the records department. She pulled Morrison's personnel file, looking for any red flags in his background. What she found was a detective with an exemplary record, perhaps too exemplary. His arrest statistics were high, his conviction rate impressive, and his financial disclosure forms showed a lifestyle that seemed beyond his salary. More concerning were the dates on his real estate transaction. Morrison had purchased a $300,000 house in Lake Oswego just 18 months earlier, paying cash according to the property record. On a detective's salary, that kind of purchase should have been impossible without significant debt. Chen spent the afternoon discreetly researching the other names in Tiffany's file. City Councilman Robert Hayes had voted in favor of zoning changes that benefited Meridian Construction Project. Building Inspector Carl Peterson had signed off on permits. Projects should have required additional review. The web of corruption was more extensive than imagined. As the day wore on, Chen noticed Morrison watching her more closely than usual. When she stepped away from her desk, she caught him glancing at her computer screen. When she mentioned following up on Tiffany's work files, he suggested they focus on more promising leads. At 6 p.m., Chen made a decision that would define the rest of the investigation. Instead of going home, she drove to the FBI field office in downtown Portland. If the Portland Police Bureau was compromised, she needed help from outside. Special Agent Linda Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran who'd handled corruption cases throughout the Pacific Northwest. Chen had met her during a joint task force operation 2 years earlier and trusted her reputation for integrity. Detective Chen, "This is unexpected," Rodriguez said, inviting her into a small conference. "What brings you to federal territory?" Chen laid out everything she discovered: Tiffany's disappearance, the evidence of money laundering, suspicious behavior of her partner, and her growing suspicion she was investigating corruption within. Rodriguez listening notes Chen presented to Tiffany. When Chen finished the federal quiet process, "This is serious," Rodriguez finally. "If your partner is compromised, and there are others in the department involved, you could be in danger. Have you shared any of this information with anyone else in the PPP?" "Not yet. I wasn't sure who to trust." "Smart. From now on, you report only to me. Continue your investigation, but be extremely careful not to let Morrison or anyone else know what you've discovered." "Can you handle that kind of deception?" Chen nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. Working undercover against her own partner went against everything she'd been trained to do. But Tiffany Clark deserved justice, and if the system was compromised, someone had to fight from the inside. Rodriguez pulled out a secure phone and handed it to Chen. "This is encrypted and untraceable. Call me immediately if you feel threatened or if you discover additional evidence. And detective, watch your back. People have disappeared for less than what you've uncovered." Driving home through Portland's quiet streets, Chen felt the weight of isolation settle around her. She was now investigating a missing person case where her own partner might be a suspect, working within a police department that might be protecting the very criminals she was trying to catch. But somewhere in the darkness, Tiffany Clark was either dead or being held prisoner by people who thought they were above the law. Chen had become her only hope for justice, even if it meant risking everything she'd built in her law enforcement career. The game had changed, and Chen was now playing by different rules. July 15th, 1994, 1 month after disappearance. Portland, Oregon. The July heat made the surveillance work even more uncomfortable, but Detective Sarah Chen had grown accustomed to spending her off-duty hours watching the people her department should have been investigating. For 4 weeks, she'd maintained the pretense of working the Tiffany Clark case alongside Morrison, while secretly building a parallel investigation with FBI assistance. The official case had stalled exactly as Chen suspected it would. Morrison had focused on dead-end leads, questioned unreliable witnesses, and consistently steered the investigation away from Meridian. The Tommy Nguyen lead had evaporated. Security footage of 3 different locations confirmed his alibi, but Morrison had insisted on pursuing other similar suspects. Chen's real investigation was taking shape in a storage unit she'd rented under a false name. The walls were covered with photographs, financial records, and organizational charts that mapped the corruption network Tiffany had discovered. The scope was staggering: dozens of construction projects, millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts, and a web of city officials who'd been bought and paid for. Agent Rodriguez had provided federal resources for the investigation, including surveillance teams and forensic accountants who confirmed Tiffany's analysis. The money laundering operation was sophisticated, using legitimate construction projects to clean drug money and skimming from city contracts to pay bribes. We've identified at least 12 city employees who've received payments through the shell company, Rodriguez reported during one of their secret meetings. Building inspector, zoning official, a deputy mayor, and 3 police officers besides Morrison. Chen studied the surveillance photos spread across the table. Any sign of Tiffany? Nothing concrete, but we've got activity at several properties connected to the organization. There's a compound in the Coast Range foothills registered to one of the shell companies. Lots of traffic, but it's too well guarded for us to get close. The compound had become Chen's obsession. Located 40 miles west of Portland, it was accessible only by a single mountain road and protected by electronic gates and armed security. Satellite imagery showed several buildings, including what appeared to be a main house and several outbuildings that could serve as holding areas. We need a warrant. Based on what? Everything we have is circumstantial. A federal judge isn't going to authorize a raid on a private compound because a missing woman was investigating financial irregularities. Rodriguez was right, but Chen couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. If Tiffany was alive, she'd been held captive for over a month, and with each day that passed, chances of the organization eliminating all evidence stronger. Chen's double life was taking its toll. At work, she had to pretend to pursue Morrison's misdirection while secretly documenting his efforts to sabotage the investigation. At home, she jumped at every unexpected sound and varied her routes to avoid establishing patterns. The paranoia was just of twice she'd noticed the same car following, and her apartment had been searched while the breakthrough came from an unexpected. Maria Santos, the office manager at Meridian Construction, called Chen's personal phone on July 20th. Detective Chen, I need to talk to you, but not at the office. There's something about Tiffany that I didn't tell you before. They met at a coffee shop in southeast Portland, far from Meridian's office and the police precinct. Santos looked nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder as he spoke. The night Tiffany disappeared, she called me at home around 9 p.m. Scared, said she'd received a threatening phone call about her snooping around and was going to meet someone who claimed to have information that would expose everything. Chen leaned forward. Did she say who she was meeting? Not a name. But she said the person claimed to be another employee who'd been afraid to come forward, someone who could prove that city officials were taking bribes and that people who asked too many questions sometimes had accidents. Why didn't you mention this before? His hand shook. She lifted her coffee. Because the next day, Mr. Castellano pulled me aside and reminded me how much my family depended on my job. He said Tiffany had probably just run off with some boyfriend and that spreading rumors would only hurt the company's reputation. Is there anything else you haven't told me? Santos reached into and pulled out a manila envelope. Tiffany gave me this a week before she said if anything happened to her, I should give it to the police, but only to someone I was sure wasn't. Inside the envelope were photocopies of bank showing payments from Meridian Construction to a company called Pacific Coast Security. The amounts were significant, $50,000 per month for over 2 years. But more important were the handwritten notes in the margin, identifying Pacific Coast Securities as a front company owned by Vinny Torino, a known associate of organized crime families in Seattle. Chen felt her pulse quicken. This was the connection they'd been looking for, the link between Meridian's money laundering and serious organized crime. Vinny Torino wasn't just a businessman. He was muscle, the kind of person who handled problems that couldn't be resolved through bribery or intimidation. Maria, I need you to know that you might be in danger. These people don't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. Santos nodded tearfully. I know. That's why I've been thinking about taking my kids to visit my sister in Phoenix, maybe staying there for a while. That's not a bad idea. But first, would you be willing to make a statement about all this to federal agents? The meeting with Santos gave the federal task force the evidence they needed to begin building RICO charges against the organization. More importantly, the connection to Vinny Torino opened up new avenues for surveillance and investigation. That evening, Chen met with Rodriguez at a secure location to plan their next moves. Torino's got a history of making problems disappear, Rodriguez explained, showing Chen his criminal file. 2 suspected murders in Seattle, both witnesses who were going to testify against his associates. The bodies were never found. You think Tiffany's dead? I think she's either dead or being held at that compound. Either way, Torino's our best lead for finding out what happened. Rodriguez outlined a plan to place Torino under intensive surveillance, hoping to catch him visiting the compound or meeting with other members of the organization. It was risky. If Torino suspected he was being watched, he might decide to eliminate any evidence of his involvement, including Tiffany. As Chen drove home through Portland's summer evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed since Tiffany's disappearance. She'd gone from being a straightforward detective to an undercover operative working against her own department. The moral complex exhausting, but every time she considered giving up, she thought about Tiffany's letter and the trust that had been placed in her. Somewhere in the Oregon wilderness, a young woman was either suffering or dead because she'd tried to do the right thing. Chen determined to make sure that sacrifice wouldn't be in vain, even if it cost her everything. August 10, 1990, 2 months missing. Coast Range foothills, Oregon. The surveillance post was little more than a hunting blind tucked into the forest overlooking the compound, but it provided a clear view of the main gate and driveway. Chen had been taking turns with FBI agents Rodriguez and Thompson, maintaining 24-hour observation of the property for 3 weeks. The compound was more active than they'd initially realized. Daily deliveries arrived from legitimate suppliers, food, construction materials, and maintenance equipment, but the nighttime visitors were more interested. Expensive cars with tinted windows, meetings that lasted exactly 30 minutes, and occasionally vehicles that arrived with multiple occupants but left with fewer. Black Escalade coming up the drive, Agent Thompson whispered into his radio. Same one that was here Tuesday night. Through high-powered binoculars, Chen watched as Vinnie Torino emerged from the passenger, followed by 2 men she didn't recognize. But the fourth person to exit the vehicle made her blood run cold. Detective Ray Morrison, still in his police department windbreak. "We've got Morrison on scene," Chen radioed to Rodriguez, who was monitoring communication 2 miles down the road. "Copy that. Are you getting this on camera?" The telephoto lens captured Morrison shaking hands with Torino, the group walking toward the main building, and most damning of all, Morrison accepting what appeared to be a thick envelope from one of Torino's associates. But the breakthrough came when Chen noticed something else through her binoculars. In one of the compound's outbuildings, a light flickered in what looked like a basement window. The flash pattern wasn't random. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS in Morse code. "Rodriguez, I'm seeing a distress signal from the east outbuilding. Someone's flashing. Are you certain?" Chen watched for another 5 minutes, a pattern repeat. "Positive. Someone's alive down there and asking for..." The evidence was finally mounting. They had Morrison's corruption on camera, proof of the compound's connection to the money laundering operation, and now a strong indication that someone was being held prisoner, but they still couldn't move without risking the life of whoever was signaling for help. Rodriguez made the decision to expand the surveillance operation. "We need eyes inside that compound. I'm authorizing an undercover infiltration." The plan was complex and dangerous. Agent Thompson would pose as a construction worker interested in jobs at Meridian Construction Project. His background would be manufactured to suggest someone with flexible ethics and a willingness to look the other way for extra money. Meanwhile, Chen faced her own challenges. Morrison's behavior toward her had become increasingly suspicious. He questioned her about her activities outside work, suggested she might be overthinking the Clark case, and twice she'd caught him going through her desk when she returned unexpected. "Sarah, maybe it's time to consider that this girl just took off," Morrison said during their morning briefing on August 15th. "We've followed every lead, interviewed everyone connected to her. Sometimes people just want to start over somewhere new." "Album. What about the blood on her car door? The evidence she was investigating money laundering?" Morrison's expression hardened. "What evidence of money laundering?" "You found some notes about construction That's not the same thing as criminal activity." Chen realized she'd revealed too much. According to the official case file, they'd never found Tiffany's detailed research. Chen had discovered it at the apartment, but never reported it to avoid exposing her parallel investigation. "I meant the accounting irregularities her co-worker mentioned." Chen backtracked, but she could see Morrison wasn't buying it. That afternoon, Chen received an encrypted call from Rodriguez with disturbing news. "Thompson's been inside for 48 hours. He's confirmed there are holding areas in the compound's basement, and he's heard voices coming from behind locked doors, but he can't get close enough to identify anyone without blowing." "Any word from our SOS signal?" Nothing for the past 2 days. Either they moved the person or, well, let's hope. Chen felt the urgency building. Every day they waited increased the risk that evidence would be destroyed and witnesses eliminated. But rushing in could trigger exactly the response they were trying to prevent. The situation became more complicated when Chen discovered she was being followed home from work. The tale was professional. Different vehicles, skilled drivers who kept their distance. Someone was monitoring her activities, and given Morrison's suspicious behavior, she suspected it was connected to the corruption network. On August 18th, Agent Thompson made contact with alarming news. They're planning to move operation. I overheard Torino talking about cleaning house and relocating assets. Whatever they're hiding at compound, they're getting ready to make it disappear. Rodriguez called an emergency meeting for that evening. Chen had to be extremely careful not to be followed, using a series of diversionary routes and checking for surveillance before arriving at the safe house. We're running out of time, Rodriguez, and our sources suggest the organization knows they're being investigated. They're preparing to eliminate evidence and witnesses. What about getting a warrant now? Still working on it, but we need something more concrete. A federal judge won't authorize a raid based on Morse code signal and undercover observations. Chen stared at the surveillance photos spread across. Morrison's corruption clear, the compound's suspicious activities were documented, and someone had been signaling for help from inside the buildings. They needed that one piece of evidence that would convince a judge lives were at stake. What if I could get Morrison to incriminate himself? Chen suggested. Wear a wire? Get him talking about his involvement? Rodriguez shook her head. Too dangerous. If he suspects you know about his corruption, you could end up like Tiffany Clark. But Chen was already formulating a plan. She'd worked with Morrison for 3 years and knew his weaknesses. His ego, his tendency to boast when he thought he had the upper hand, his need to justify his actions to himself and others. Give me 48 hours, Chen said. I think I know how to get him to talk. The next morning, Chen began laying the groundwork for what might be the most dangerous gamble of her career. She was going to confront her partner, her corruption, to try to save Tiffany Clark before it's too late. August 20th, 1990, 6:30 a.m., FBI Safe House, Portland. The wire was smaller than Chen had expected, no bigger than a button shirt, but wearing it felt like carrying a loaded weapon against. Agent Rodriguez made final adjustments to the transmitter, while Agent Thompson monitored the audio level from the surveillance van parked 3 blocks. Remember, we need him to admit specific details about his involvement, Rodriguez instructed. Payment amounts, dates, his knowledge of Tiffany's fate, anything that directly implicates him in the conspiracy. Chen checked her service weapon for the 3rd time that morning. If Morrison discovered the wire, she might need to defend herself against someone that she'd trusted with her life 3 years. What's my backup plan if he gets suspicious? You get out immediately. Don't try to salvage the operation. Just survive, and we'll find another way. The plan was deceptively simple. Chen would approach Morrison's story about discovering new evidence, the Clark evidence that implicated people high up in the city government. She'd suggest that maybe they should consider managation to protect their careers, giving Morrison an opening to reveal his own career. At 7:45 a.m., Chen arrived at the precinct and found Morrison already at his desk, reviewing case files with unusual intensity. She noticed he'd been coming in earlier and staying later recently, as if he was trying to stay ahead of. Ray, we need to talk, Chen, settling into the chair beside. I've been thinking about the Clark case, and I'm starting to wonder if we're in over our heads. Morrison looked up from his paperwork, his expression carefully neutral. What do you mean? I've been doing some background employer, and there are some connections that could be embarrassing. City, important people who might not want their business relationship scrutinized too closely. Chen watched Morrison's face carefully. His pupils dilated slightly, a sign of stress or interest, and his hand movements became more controlled. What kind of connections? Meridian Construction has contracts with the city worth millions of dollars. The approval process involved several officials who might not appreciate having their decisions questioned during a high-profile missing person investigation. Morrison leaned back in his chair, and Chen caught a glimpse of something she'd never seen before in her partner's calculation. He was weighing his options, trying to determine how much she knew and how much of a threat she represented. Sarah, sometimes investigations uncover things that are better left alone, especially when those things involve people who have the power to end careers. Chen felt her heart rate increase, kept her voice steady. Are you suggesting we should drop the Clark case? I'm suggest smart. Focus on the obvious suspects, avoid unnecessary complications, and remember, the primary responsibility is to the department and to our own futures. It wasn't enough. Chen needed Morrison to be more specific, to admit his own involvement, rather than just suggesting general corruption. She decided, "Ray, I found something at Clark's apartment that I didn't put in the official report. Financial documents that suggest Meridian Construction was involved in money laundering. If that comes out during the investigation, it's going to implicate a lot of important people." Morrison's demeanor changed instantly. The casual conversation was over, and Chen could see him shifting into damage copies of invoice and payment record showing systematic overpayments to shell companies. Clark had been tracking the money trail for months. Morrison stood up and walked to the window. When he spoke, his voice carried a tension he'd never heard. "Sarah, there are things about this you don't, things that go way beyond one missing accountant. Then explain them to Morrison." Chen saw something in his expression that made her instinctively move closer to her service. He looked like a man who'd run out. "You want to know the truth?" Tiffany Clark was a problem that needed to be. She was digging into business relationships that certain people wanted to keep private. When she wouldn't listen to warnings to back off, stronger measures became necessary. Chen felt the wire recording every word, but she needed more. What kind of stronger measure? The kind that ensures problems don't become public embarrassment. Clark thought she was some kind of crusader for justice, but all she was doing was threatening legitimate business relationships that benefit this city. "Ray, are you telling me you know what happened to her?" Morrison walked back down, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I'm telling you that sometimes good cops have to make difficult decisions to protect the larger interests of law and order." Chen pressed further. "Did you know about the meeting she went to on June 15th? I arranged the meeting." Clark needed to understand that her investigation was going to hurt innocent people. "We tried to reason with her, but she was too stubborn to listen." The admission hit Chen like a physical blow. Her partner, someone she'd worked alongside for 3 years, had just confessed to luring Tiffany into a trap. Where is she now? Morrison studied Chen's, and she wondered if he could see the wire or hear the faint electronic hum of the transmitter. That depends on whether she's learned to be more reasonable about her Civic. Is she alive? Sarah, you're asking questions that could put both of us in very dangerous position. There are people involved in this situation who don't hesitate to protect their interests, and they won't make distinctions between nosy accountant and overly curious detective. The threat was clear, and Chen realized she'd gotten everything she was going to get from Morrison without exposing herself to immediate danger. But as she prepared to end the conversation, Morrison said something that made her blood. "You know, it's interesting that you're suddenly so curious about details you never cared about. Makes a person wonder if you've been talking to the wrong people or asking the wrong questions in the wrong." Chen met his stare with flinching. "I'm just trying to close it. Same as always. I hope so." Because loyalty is the most important quality a police officer can have. Disloyalty, on the other hand, can have very serious consequences. Chen gathered her notes and stood up, keeping her movements casual despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'll keep that in mind." As she walked away from Morrison's desk, Chen realized that her life had just fundamentally changed. She was no longer just investigating corruption. She was now a target of the same organization that had taken Tiffany. August 20th, 1990, 3:30 p.m. FBI Field Office, downtown Portland. The recording of Chen's conversation with Morrison played secure conference, each word carrying the weight of federal evidence. Agent Rodriguez paused the playback key moments, highlighting Morrison's admission for the federal prosecutor who'd joined the meeting. "I arranged the meeting. That's direct involvement in kidnapping," noted Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh. "And his threats against Detective Chen constitute witness intimidation. We have enough to arrest Morrison immediately." Chen sat quietly as the legal team dissected her partner's words, feeling a mixture of vindication and betrayal. 3 years of working alongside Morrison, trusting him with her life during dangerous situations, only to discover he'd been corrupt the entire time. "The question," Rodriguez continued, "is whether we arrest him now and risk losing Tiffany Clark or use his arrest as leverage to force him to reveal her location. What's the compound surveillance showing?" Walsh. Agent Thompson consulted reports. "Increased activity over the past 48 hours. Multiple vehicles arriving and leaving, including what appears to be cleaning crews and document removal. They're definitely preparing to abandon the site." Chen leaned forward. "If we wait much longer, any evidence of what happened to Tiffany is going to disappear. These people don't leave loose ends." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "I agree, but we need to be strategic about this. Morrison is small time compared to the larger organization. We need him to flip on his handlers. We're going to shut down the entire operation. The decision was made to arrest Morrison at his home that evening, away from the precinct where other corrupt officers might warn him or interfere. Chen would participate in the arrest, both to maintain her cover and to confront Morrison with the evidence of his betrayal. At 6:15 p.m., Chen sat in an unmarked FBI vehicle outside Morrison's Lake Oswego home, watching her former partner through his kitchen window as he ate dinner with his family. The domestic scene made the situation even more surreal. Morrison laughing with his wife and teenage daughter, completely unaware that his world was about. "Target is in the kitchen," Rodriguez radioed from his position across the street. "No other vehicles in the driveway. Looks like just family members present." Chen checked her service weapon one more time, though she hoped Morrison wouldn't resist. Despite everything he'd done, part of her still remembered the man who'd taught her how to read crime scenes and supported her during her first year as a detective. At exactly 6:30 p.m., the arrest team moved into position. Chen approached the front door while FBI agents covered the back exits and side yards. The element of surprise was crucial. Morrison was an experienced police officer who wouldn't hesitate to destroy evidence or flee if he suspected was happening. The doorbell rang and Chen heard footsteps approaching from inside. When Morrison opened the door, his expression shifted from casual greeting to alarm as he saw Chen flanked by federal agents. "Ray Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, money laundering, and obstruction of." Rodriguez stepping forward with hand. Morrison's wife appeared behind him. Confusion, fear, evident. "Ray, what's happening? Who are these people?" "It's okay, Lynn. Just cooperate with call my lawyer." As Rodriguez read Morrison, Chen watched her former partner's face for any sign of the man she knew. Instead, he saw calculation. Morrison was already planning his next move, trying to figure out how to minimize to him. The ride to the federal building was conducted in Morrison sitting in the back between two agents, while Chen rode in the front. Several times she felt his eyes on her, and when she finally turned around, he was staring at her with an expression of cold assessment. "You were wearing a wire this morning, Morrison." It wasn't a question. Chen didn't respond, but Morrison continued talking as if she had. "I wondered why you were suddenly so interested in details. Should have trusted my instincts about you. Where is Tiffany Clark?" Morrison humor. "You think this is about one missing accountant? Sarah, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself in." "Then explain it to me. The people you're trying to take down don't just disappear problem. They eliminate them completely. You think arresting me is going to save Tiffany? All you've done is guarantee that any evidence of what happened to her gets destroyed." Chen felt a chill run. If Morrison was right, their investigation might have just signed Tiffany's death warrant. At the federal building, Morrison was processed and placed in an interview room. Rodriguez and Walsh spent 20 minutes reviewing their strategy before beginning the interrogation. They had one chance to get Morrison to cooperate before his lawyer arrived and shut down all communication. "Detective Morrison," Rodriguez began, settling into the chair across from him, "you're facing federal charges that carry a minimum sentence of 15 years, but we're prepared to discuss cooperation if you're willing to help us locate Tiffany Clark." Morrison leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed despite his... "You want to make a deal? I'll need guarantees about protection for my family and relocation assistance. We can discuss those arrangements, but first, we need to know, is Tiffany Clark alive?" For the first time since his arrest, Morrison's composure cracked slightly. He looked at Chen, then back at Rodriguez, weighing his option. "As of yesterday morning, yes, but my arrest changes everything. The people holding her are going to assume she's a liability now." Chen leaned forward urgently. "Where is she being held?" Morrison studied their faces before responding. "The compound you've been watching isn't just a safe house, it's a processing center. People who become problems for the organization get taken there for evaluation. Sometimes they're released after they agree to cooperate. Sometimes they're not." Evaluation was Tiffany undergoing. They were trying to determine how much she'd shared with other people and whether her disappearance would trigger a serious investigation. "Your investigation?" Morrison looked directly at Chen. "Congratulations, Detective. You just answered both those questions for them." Rodriguez slammed his hand on the table. "If you know where she is, you need to tell us right now. Every minute we waste increases the danger she's in." Morrison was several minutes, clearly struggling with finally his voice barely a compound that doesn't appear on any of the architecture. "That's where they keep who need to be kept quiet while decisions are made about their futures." "How do we get her out?" Morrison shook his head. "You don't understand. The compound is just one part of a much larger operation. Even if you raid it tonight and find her, The organization will just relocate and continue operating. You'll save one person and lose the chance to shut down a network that's been operating for over a decade. Chen stood up, her patience exhausted. I don't care about your network. I care about saving Tiffany Clark. Then you're going to get her killed, Morrison replied, because the only way to save her is to take down the entire organization before they can eliminate the evidence. Rodriguez looked at his watch. How long do we have? And answered. Chen's blood ran cold. If she's already. August 20th, 1994. 9:45 p.m. Federal Building, Portland. The Situation Room buzzed with activity as federal agents coordinated what might be Tiffany Clark's last chance for survival. Satellite images of the compound covered one wall, while tactical teams reviewed floor plans and Morrison's detailed description of the basement level. If Morrison's telling the truth, we have maybe 6 hours before they eliminate any evidence, Rodriguez announced the assembled team. That means we go in fast and hard. No time. Extended surveillance. Careful. Chen studied the compound's layout, noting the defensive position and limited access. What about the other prisoners mentioned? Are we prepared to extract multiple victims? We have to assume that's a possibility, Agent. Medical teams are standing by, and we've got transport ready for anyone we might find. Morrison had provided a wealth of tactical intelligence in exchange for federal protection, but his motivations remained suspect. Chen couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding back crucial information, perhaps as insurance for his survival. I want to be part of the assault team, Chen declared, checking equipment. Rodriguez shook his too dangerous. You've been compromised, and if there are other corrupt officers involved, your presence could signal that this is more than a routine raid. These people took my case and turned my partner against me. I need to be there when we find Tiffany. The argument was interrupted by Agent Thompson's urgent voice from the communication. We've got movement at the compound, multiple vehicles arriving. Looks like they're accelerating the timeline. On the monitoring screens, Chen could see headlights moving up the mountain road toward the compound. If Morrison was right about the organization's decision to eliminate evidence, they were witnessing the beginning of the end for anyone being held. Change of plans. We move now. The convoy of federal vehicles left Portland at 10:30 p.m., racing through the darkness toward the Coast Range foothills. Chen rode with the tactical team, her mind focused on the possibility that Tiffany might still be alive after more than 2 months in captivity. During the 40-minute drive, Morrison provided additional details through a secure radio link from his holdings, the compound's security system, location, the hidden basement entrance, and most crucially, the identity of Vincent Torino as the person making life-and-death decisions about prisoners. Torino's probably there tonight, Morris crackled. If they've decided to clean house, he'll want to oversee the operation. Chen felt her pulse quicken. Torino was the key to the entire money laundering operation, and capturing him would validate months of investigation. But more important, he might be the only person who knew exactly what had happened. The compound appeared peaceful as the federal convoy took positions along the access road. Lights were on in several buildings, but there was no sign of the frantic activity Thompson had reported from the surveillance post. Something's wrong, Rodriguez, as they crouched in the forest overlooking the main. Quiet. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Either they've already finished their cleanup, or this is a trap. The tactical team moved into position with military precision, surrounding the compound and preparing for simultaneous entry through multiple access points. Chen was assigned to the team breaching the main house, where Morrison had indicated Torino would likely be directing operation. At exactly 11:47 p.m., 12 hours after Morrison's arrest, Rodriguez gave the signal to the assault was swift and overwhelming. Federal agents poured through doors and windows, shouting commands and securing suspects before they could destroy evidence or flee. Chen followed the tactical team through the main house, clearing rooms and searching for any sign of Torino or other high-value targets. The basement level was exactly where Morrison had described it, accessible through a hidden door behind a false wall in the kitchen. As Chen descended the narrow stairs, she could hear voices echoing from somewhere in the darkness ahead. The basement was larger than the satellite imagery had suggested, with multiple rooms branching off a central corridor. The first room contained sophisticated communications equipment and filing cabinets full of financial. The second held weapons and surveillance gear. The third room that made Chen's heart. Tiffany Clark was alive, chained to a concrete wall in what could only be described as a makeshift prison cell. She was unconscious, severely malnourished, and showed signs of prolonged physical abuse. But she was breathing. Medical team to the basement level immediately, Chen radioed, kneeling beside Tiffany and checking for vital signs. We've got a survivor. As paramedics worked to stabilize Tiffany, Chen explored the rest of the basement level. 2 other cells showed evidence of recent occupation, but they were empty. Blood stains on the walls suggested that not all prisoners had been as fortunate as Tiffany. The breakthrough came when Agent Thompson discovered Vincent Torino in a panic room behind the main office, desperately trying to destroy hard drives and paper documents. His arrest was anticlimactic compared to the months of investigation. Chen felt a surge of satisfaction watching the man who'd orchestrated Tiffany's imprisonment being handcuffed. Vincent Torino, you're under arrest for kidnapping, money laundering, conspiracy, and about a dozen other federal charges we'll discuss downtown, Rodriguez announced. Torino's response surprised everyone. I want to make a deal. I've got information about corruption that goes higher than you can imagine. A drone. As dawn broke over the comp, Chen rode in the ambulance with Tiffany, who had regained consciousness but remained too weak to speak coherently. The past 2 months had taken a severe toll. The doctors were optimistic about her recovery. You're safe now, Chen whispered, holding Tiffany's hand as the ambulance raced toward Portland. It's over. But Chen knew it wasn't really. Torino's offer to cooperate suggested the corruption network was even more extensive than they'd realized. Morrison had been just one corrupt detective in a system that might be compromised at multiple levels. The rescue of Tiffany Clark was a victory. It was also the beginning of a much larger investigation that would ultimately expose the full scope of organized crime's infiltration into Portland's government and law enforcement community. As the city skyline came into view, Chen reflected on how much had changed since that morning in June when she'd first seen Tiffany's abandoned. The naive detective who'd trusted her partner and believed in the system had been replaced by someone who understood that justice sometimes required working outside the very institutions supposed to protect it. Tiffany stirred in the ambulance, her eyes focusing on Chen's face with recognition. "Detective," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Did you get them?" Chen squeezed her hand gently. "We got some of them, but now we need your help to get the rest." August 25th, 1994, 10 Moema, Federal Courthouse, Portland. Vincent Torino sat across from the prosecution team in an orange jail jumpsuit, his expensive suit replaced by institutional clothing that diminished his once imposing presence. 5 days in federal custody had aged him considerably, and the confident businessman who'd overseen the compound had been replaced by someone calculating his remaining option. "My client is prepared to provide comprehensive information about the money laundering," announced attorney Michael Hoffman, one of Portland's most expensive criminal defense lawyers. "In exchange, we're seeking witness protection and a maximum sentence of 7 years, Assistant U.S. Attorney Wall shook her head. "Your client is looking at parole on the kidnapping charges alone. Consider reducing that to 25 years. His information." Chen sat in the corner of the interview, officially present as the investigating officer, but primarily there to hear what had happened to Tiffany during her 2-month captivity. Tiffany was recovering at OHSU Hospital, too weak to participate, but improving daily. Rodriguez leaned forward across. "Let's start with Tiffany Clark. Walk us through exactly what happened from the night she was taken." Torino glanced at his attorney, who nodded permission to proceed. When he began speaking, his voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting a business transaction rather than describing kidnapping and attempted murder. The Clark woman had become a problem by early June. Our sources at Meridian Construction reported that she was copying financial records and asking questions about payments to shell company. Frank Castellano was getting nervous about her investigation. "What sources?" Walsh interrupted. "Besides Detective Morrison, we had people placed positions throughout the construction industry, city government, building inspectors, zoning officials, accounting firms, anyone who might notice irregularity." Chen made notes as Torino continued, trying to keep her emotions in check as he described the systematic corruption that had made Tiffany's kidnapping possible. "We initially tried subtle pressure," Torino explained. Anonymous phone calls suggesting she focus on her regular duties, a break-in at her apartment to search for copied documents, having her followed to make her nervous. But Clark was too determined for her own good. "So you decided to eliminate her." "Not eliminate, neutralized. The plan was to determine how much she knew, who she'd shared information with, and whether she could be convinced to forget what she'd discovered. Rodriguez consulted his notes. Detective Morrison arranged the meeting on June 15th. Morrison was our primary law enforcement but he wasn't the only one. The meeting was his idea. Bring Clark to a controlled environment where we could assess the threat she represented. Chen couldn't remain silent any longer. Kept her prisoner for over 2 months. How is that assessment? Torino's expression remained neutral. Ms. Clark was uncooperative. She refused to reveal who else she'd shared her research with, insisted she could expose our entire operation, and demanded to be released to continue her investigation. She left us few alternatives. So you tortured her? We applied pressure, Torino. Sleep deprivation, isolation, psychological manipulation. We needed to break down her resistance and determine the full scope of the threat. Hoffman intervened. My client wants it on record that no permanent physical harm was intended. The goal was always to secure Ms. Clark's cooperation, not to cause injury. Walsh's voice was ice cold. Your client held a woman prisoner in a basement cell for 67. Let's not pretend this was a business mission. Chen studied Torino's face, scribed the ordeal, looking for any sign of remorse or humanity. Instead, she saw the clinical detachment of someone who'd reduced human suffering to a cost-benefit analysis. Tell us about the organizational structure, continued. Who was giving you orders? Torino paused, clearly weighing how much revealed. The money laundering operation was overseen by a council of 5 individuals representing different aspects of the business. Construction industry leaders, organized crime figures from Seattle and Vancouver, and political figures who provided protection and regulatory approval. Names? Frank Castellano from Meridian Construction, Marcus Webb, who controls most of the concrete suppliers Pacific Northwest, Anthony Lucchese from the Seattle families, City Councilman Robert Hayes, and Deputy Mayor Patricia Morrison. Chen's pen stopped moving. Patricia Morrison? Any relation to his sister? She was recruited through him, initially just to provide information about zoning decisions and municipal contracts, but her role expanded as she proved reliable. The scope of the corruption the network had infiltrated in companies, organized crime, city government, and law enforcement. Tiffany Clark had stumbled onto something far more complex than simple counting irregularity. How much money are we talking about? Over the past 5 years, approximately $50 million in drug proceeds were cleaned through construction. The profits were split among the council members and used to pay bribes, maintain operation, and expand into new territory. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, and Tiffany Clark discovered that by accident. She was thorough in her work, perhaps too thorough. She noticed that Meridian's material costs were disproportionately high compared to industry standards, and began tracking payments to determine where the money was actually going. When did you realize her investigation was a serious threat to expression? When she started asking questions about Pacific Northwest Materials and traced the corporate ownership back to our shell company. By that point, she'd documented enough of the money trail to expose the entire operation. Chen felt sick listening to the clinical description of how Tiffany's dedication to her job had made her a target. A young woman trying to do her work properly had walked into the middle of a massive criminal conspiracy. Let's talk about the night she was taken. Walk us through exactly what happened. Torino consulted with his attorney briefly before continuing. Morrison made contact, claiming to have information about the irregularities she'd discovered. The meeting was set for Industrial Boulevard because it was isolated environment. Who else was? Besides Morrison and myself, we had 4 associate security. The plan was to bring Clark to the compound question, but she became suspicious almost immediately. Chen leaned forward. What happened? First, Torino's composure cracked. Tried to run, made it about 50 feet before one of my men tackled her. She fought like hell, screaming and scratching. We had to sedate her to get her to the compound. The image of Tiffany fighting for her freedom in that dark warehouse lot was burned into Chen's mind. A brave woman who'd realized too late their search for truth had led her into mortal danger. What were you planning to do with once you had answered her question? Torino was quiet for a long moment. That would have depended on her level of cooperation and the threat she continued to present. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality. If Tiffany had proven to be an ongoing threat, she would have been murdered. Her survival was due primarily to her refusal to provide information that might have sealed her fate. Chen looked at her note, filled with systematic details of corruption, violence, and realized they were only scratching the surface of what Torino knew. The confession would continue for hours, revealing the full scope of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. But most importantly, they were building an airtight case against everyone involved in Tiffany Clark's kidnapping and torture. Justice had been delayed for 2 months, finally within reach. August 25, 1990, 2:30 p.m. Federal Courthouse, Portland. After a brief lunch break, Torino's confession resumed with even more damaging revelation. The afternoon session focused on the operational details of Tiffany's captivity and the systematic cover-up that had nearly succeeded in making her disappear forever. "Let's continue with what happened after you brought Ms. Clark to the compound," Rodriguez said, settling back into his chair for what promised to be a long afternoon of testimony. Torino shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing that his next would seal his fate and potentially save his life. "She was unconscious when we arrived at the compound around 1:30 a.m. We put her in one of the basement holding cells, decided how to proceed." "How many holding cells were there?" 4 cells total, designed for short-term detention, while we evaluated threats to the organization. Clark's case was unusual because most people operated within a few. Chen made detailed notes as Torino described the compound's layout. What they'd discovered during the raid was apparently just one component of a larger criminal infrastructure. "When did Ms. Clark regain consciousness?" "Around noon the next day. She was disoriented and scared, but when I explained her situation, she immediately demanded to be released and threatened to expose everyone involved." "What was her situation as you explained it?" Torino paused, consulting his attorney before continuing. "I told her that she'd uncovered information about business relationships that were important, powerful people, that her investigation threatened legitimate enterprise and could damage the economic interests of the region." "How did she respond?" "She laughed at me, said she knew the difference between legitimate business and money laundering, and that no amount of intimidation would make her pretend otherwise." Chen surged his courage, even as she realized how dangerous defiance had been. "What happened next?" "We tried various approaches. The first, offering her money to forget what discovered, suggesting that her family's safety depended on her cooperation, explaining that it was in over her head, forces beyond her understanding. And when those approaches, Torino's voice became quiet, escalated pressure, sleep deprivation, withholding food, psychological manipulation. We needed to break down her resistance." Walsh leaned forward aggressively. "You tortured her." "We applied interrogation techniques designed to encourage cooperation, but his euphemistic language fooled no one." "Describe these techniques specifically." Torino glanced at his attorney, who nodded reluctantly. "Sleep deprivation by keeping lights on constant and playing loud music, irregular feeding schedule, isolation except during questioning, temperature manipulation, keeping the cell either very cold or very." Chen felt her stomach turn as she imagined Tiffany enduring weeks of systematic abuse, but she continued taking notes. Every detail would be crucial to prosecution. "Did Ms. Clark ever provide the information you were seeking?" "She gave us some details about her research method and confirmed that she hadn't shared her complete findings with anyone, but she refused to identify her sources or reveal where she'd hidden copies of the financial record." "What sources? What records?" "Clark claimed she'd been in contact with other people who suspected financial irregularities in city contracts. She also insisted she'd made copies of all the evidence and hidden them where they'd be found if anything happened." Rodriguez: "Were either of those claims true?" "We never found evidence of additional sources, and despite searching her apartment multiple times, we never located any hidden record, but we couldn't be certain she was lying." The revelation explained why Tiffany had been kept alive so long. Her captors couldn't risk killing her, while they believed she might have shared information with others or created an insurance policy of hidden evidence. "Tell us about the decision-making process," Walsh continued. "Who determined how long to hold her and what methods to use?" "The council met weekly to discuss ongoing operation." Clark's case was a standing agenda item because she represented such a significant threat. Frank Castellano wanted her eliminated immediately, but the rest of us preferred to extract all pull information first. "When did the torture escalate to physical abuse?" Torino's composure cracked again. "After about 3 weeks, when it became clear that psychological pressure wasn't." She remained defiant, insisted she would never stop fighting to expose us, threatened to identify everyone involved, even if it cost her life. "So you had her beaten Physical coercion was applied selectively and strategically to Rinos, his clinical language failing to mask the reality of what he was describing. Chen struggled to maintain her professional demeanor as Torino detailed the systematic brutalization of a woman whose only crime had been trying to do her job with integrity. How long did the physical abuse continue? Throughout July and early August, we were running out of options and time. There were rumors that federal agents were in quest of construction industry practice, and we suspected Clark's disappearance might be unwanted. Rodriguez consulted his timeline. When did you decide to eliminate? The decision was made on August 18th after Detective Morrison reported that his partner was asking suspicious questions about the case. We realized the investigation wasn't going to be allowed to die quietly, but she was still alive. We raided the compound. I delayed the execution order because I wanted to question her one more time of hidden evidence. If she'd created some kind of insurance, I needed to know what it contained before we eliminated. Chen realized that Torino's caution had inadvertently saved Tiffany. If he'd been less thorough in his approach to covering up the crime, she would have been murdered days before the federal. Let's cover up, Walsh. How did you prevent a serious investigation into Ms. Clark's disappearance? Detective Morrison was our primary asset, but we also had sources in the medical examiner's office, the district attorney's office, and several city departments. Information flowed to us about any investigation that might threaten our operation. Specifically, how did Detective Morrison sabotage? He misdirected the investigation toward dead-end suppressed evidence that might have led to Meridian Construction and provided us with regular updates about what his partner was discovering. Chen felt a fresh wave of betrayal as she realized how completely Morrison had undermined her effort to find Tiffany. Every lead she'd pursued, every theory she'd developed, had been reported back to the people who'd kidnapped her. Were there other law enforcement officers involved? 3 patrol officers who provided information about crime scene evidence, a sergeant in the detective division who could influence case assignments, resource, and 2 officers in the property room who could ensure that certain evidence disappeared or was contaminated. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Torino's network had infiltrated law enforcement at multiple levels, creating a system where serious investigations could be neutralized before they threatened the organization's interest. What would have happened if Detective Chen hadn't discovered the parallel investigation? Torino looked directly at Chen for the first time during the confession. Ms. Clark would have been killed, her body disposed of in a way that ensured it would never be found. The official investigation would have concluded she'd run away to start a new life somewhere else. And your operation would have continued? With minor adjustments to improve security and reduce future risk. We'd been operating successfully for over 5 years, and one missing accountant wasn't going to stop it. Chen realized that her decision to work with the FBI had not only saved Tiffany's life, but prevented the network from continuing to operate with impunity. The investigation that had started with a simple missing person report had exposed corruption that reached into every level of Portland's government and law enforcement community. As Torino's confession continued into the evening, the full scope of the criminal enterprise became clear. $50 million in laundered money, dozens of corrupted officials, and a system designed to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose them. But most importantly, they now had a comprehensive work dismantling the entire operation and ensuring that everyone. August 26, 1994, 6 Moantia, Federal Building, Portland. The arrest warrants were signed before dawn, authorizing simultaneous raids on 17 locations across Portland and the surrounding metropolitan area. Agent Rodriguez coordinated the operation from the FBI Command Center, while Chen prepared to participate in the arrest of Frank Castellano, the man whose money laundering operation had started the entire chain of events. Remember, these people know we're coming. Rodriguez assembled a Torino's arrest and Morrison's disappearance from duty haven't gone unnoticed. Expect them to be prepared for law enforcement contact. Chen checked her equipment one final time, feeling a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about the confrontation. After months of investigating shadows and suspicion, they were finally moving against the entire network in a coordinated strike designed to prevent evidence destruction and witness intimidation. The first arrest was City Councilman Robert Hayes, taken into custody at his Eastmoreland home as he prepared to leave for what neighbors later described as an unusually early morning trip to his cabin in Central Oregon. Federal agents found $150,000 in cash in his travel luggage, along with documents detailing offshore accounts and instructions for accessing safe deposit boxes in 3 different banks. Deputy Mayor Patricia Morrison was arrested at City Hall, where she'd arrived at 5:30 a.m. to access her office computer and shred documents. The digital forensics team recovered dozens of deleted files showing communications with shell companies and authorization code for fraudulent municipal contracts. But the most dramatic arrest occurred at Meridian. Frank Castellano spent the night destroying financial records and preparing to. Chen was part of the team that found him in his office at 6:40 a.m., feeding documents into an industrial while his assistant burned files in a metal trash can. Frank Castellano, you're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. Drawing her weapons, federal agents secured this. Castellano looked up from the shredder with resignation rather than surprise. I wondered when you people would figure it out. Took you longer than expected. Where are the complete financial records of the shell company? What you see is what you get to. Everything else went through the shredder hours ago. But Castellano had underestimated federal digital forensics capability. Computer specialists recovered deleted files, reconstructed shredded documents, and traced electronic communication that painted a picture of the money laundering operation. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed millions of dollars flowing through shell companies to legitimate construction projects, with systematic overcharges used to launder drug proceeds. City contracts had been awarded based on bribery rather than competitive bidding, and building inspections had been manipulated to approve substandard work. You destroyed people's lives for money, Chen says. Castellano. I provided jobs and economic growth for this region. The fact that some of the money came from unconventional sources doesn't change the positive impact on the community. Chen shook her head at his ration. Even facing federal charges, Castellano couldn't acknowledge the human cost criminal enterprise. The sweep continued throughout the morning, with arrests at construction sites, government offices, and private residence. Marcus Webb was taken into custody while trying to board a private plane at Hillsborough Airport. Anthony Lucchese was arrested at a Seattle hotel, where he'd been coordinating the destruction of records and the elimination of potential witnesses. By noon, 16 members of the criminal network were in federal custody, facing charges ranging from money laundering to kidnapping. Only one target had escaped. Detective Morrison's sister, Patricia, had fled Portland during the night, leaving behind evidence of her involvement, but avoiding immediate. The psychological impact on Portland's government and law enforcement community was immediate, profound. The revelation that city officials had been systematically corrupted by organized crime triggered calls for investigations into dozens of municipal contracts and zoning. Police Chief William Patterson called an emergency press conference at 2 p.m., announcing the suspension of all officers connected to the corruption investigation and promising a comprehensive review of department procedures. The betrayal of public trust presented by these arrests is unprecedented in our city's history, Patterson announced. We will cooperate fully with federal investigators to ensure that justice is served and that such corruption never again takes root in Portland's institution. Chen watched the press conference from the FBI field office, where she was processing evidence and preparing witness statements. The investigation that had begun with Tiffany Clark's disappearance had evolved into the largest corruption case in Oregon's history. Agent Walsh joined her in the conference room, carrying files thick with evidence and witness statements. We've got enough to put most of these people away for decades. Torino's confession, combined with the documentary evidence, creates an airtight case against the entire network. What about the people who weren't arrested today? We're working down the list. There are probably dozens of city employees who took bribes or ignored irregularities, but we're focusing on the major players first. The smaller fish will either cooperate or face separate prosecution. Chen thought about the scope of the corruption that had been exposed. Tiffany Clark's dedication to accuracy in her accounting work had uncovered a criminal enterprise that reached into every level of Portland's government and business community. Any word on Tiffany's condition? She's improving steadily. The doctors say she'll make a full physical recovery, though the psychological trauma will take longer to heal. She's been asking about the investigation and wants to testify when the trials begin. Chen felt a sense of closure beginning to develop. Tiffany was alive, recovering, her captors were in custody, and the corrupt network that had nearly killed her was being dismantled piece by piece. But questions remained about the extent of the corruption and whether other criminal organizations had similar operations in different cities. Torino's network might have been unique in its scope and sophistication, or it might have been one example of a broader pattern of organized crime infiltration into legitimate government and business institutions. As evening approached, Chen prepared her final reports on the investigation, documenting the timeline from Tiffany's disappearance to the coordinated arrest. The case that had begun with an abandoned Honda Civic in an industrial warehouse district had exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of city government. More importantly, it had demonstrated that individual integrity and determination could overcome systematic corruption, even when the system itself was compromised. Tiffany Clark's courage in pursuing the truth, despite threats and intimidation, had ultimately brought justice to an organization that thought itself untouchable. The network had unraveled, but the real work of rebuilding public trust and ensuring accountability was just beginning. December 15, 1994. 10:30 a.m., Federal Courthouse, Portland. 6 months after her disappearance, Tiffany Clark sat in the witness chair facing the federal jury that would decide the fate of Vincent Torino and 11 co-conspirators. Her recovery had been remarkable. Physically, she'd regained most of the weight she'd lost during captivity, and psychologically, she'd found strength in her role as the prosecution star. Chen watched from the gallery as Tiffany described her ordeal with clarity and determination. The woman who'd been chained in a basement cell had transformed into a powerful advocate for justice, her testimony providing the human impact that gave meaning to the financial evidence. Mr. Torino told me that I was naive to think my investigation mattered, Tiffany, looking directly at her former captor. He said that powerful people had invested too much in their system for one accountant to make a difference. But sitting here today, I think we've proven him wrong. Torino's attorney had attempted to minimize his client's role, portraying him as a mid-level functionary following orders from more powerful figures. But Tiffany's testimony, combined with recordings of confession, documentary evidence, painted a picture of someone who'd made calculated decisions to kidnap, torture, and potentially murder an innocent woman. During the 2 months you were held captive, Prosecutor Walsh asked, did Mr. Torino ever express remorse for what he was putting you through? Never. He treated my captivity like a business problem that required efficient resolution. Even when he ordered the physical abuse, it was described as applying pressure or encouraging cooperation, as if using euphemisms less real. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses, including FBI agents, forensic accountants, and city employees who'd been coerced into participating in the corruption scheme. Each day had revealed new details about the scope and sophistication of the money laundering operation. Detective Ray Morrison had pled guilty to federal charges in exchange for his cooperation, receiving a 15-year sentence that had shocked his former colleague. His testimony about police corruption had been particularly damaging, revealing how law enforcement resources had been perverted to protect criminal interests. Detective Morrison was like a brother to me, Morrison's former partner to discover that he'd been working for the people who kidnapped Ms. Clark was the most difficult betrayal I've ever experienced in law enforcement. Chen had also testified, describing her investigation and the challenges of pursuing justice when her own partner was compromised. Her decision to work with federal agents outside the normal chain of command had been vindicated, but it had fundamentally changed her relationship with the Portland Police Bureau. The verdicts were announced on December 20th, just 5 days before Christmas. Vincent Torino was convicted on all charges, including kidnapping, money laundering, and conspiracy, receiving a life sentence without possibility of parole. Frank Castellano got 25 years, while the corrupt city officials received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Justice has been served for Tiffany Clark and for the citizens of Portland, Judge Martinez said after the final sentencing. These convictions send a clear message that corruption will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, regardless of the perpetrator's positions in society. But the trials were only part of the story's resolution. The broader impact on Portland's government and law enforcement community continued to unfold throughout 1995, with reforms designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. Chen had been promoted to sergeant and assigned to a newly created public integrity unit tasked with investigating corruption in city government. Her experience with the Clark case made her uniquely qualified to understand how criminal organizations could infiltrate legitimate institutions. The most important lesson Chen wrote training detectives is that corruption thrives in isolation. When honest people work together and share information, it becomes much harder for a criminal organization to operate with impunity. Tiffany Clark had returned to work as an accountant, though not in the construction industry. She'd found employment with a non-profit organization focused on government transparency, using her experience to help identify financial irregularities in public sector contracts. "I've learned that numbers tell stories," Tiffany explained during a speaking engagement at Portland State University. "My job is to listen to what those numbers are saying and to speak up when they're telling stories about corruption or fraud." The psychological scars from her captivity would never fully disappear, but Tiffany had channeled her trauma into a mission to prevent others from experiencing what she'd endured. Her testimony had been crucial in convicting the people who had nearly destroyed her life. Chen visited Tiffany occasionally, maintaining the connection that had been forged during the investigation. They'd both been changed. Chen's faith in law enforcement shattered and rebuilt on more solid, while Tiffany's belief in justice had been ultimately strengthened. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't decided to pursue the case when Morrison was trying to shut it down," Tiffany, during one of their conversations. "You would have been killed, and the corruption would have continued, Chen, but you didn't let that happen. Your refusal to give in, even under torture, gave us the time we needed to build a case." The Clark case became a landmark in federal prosecution of municipal corruption, studied in law school and cited in subsequent investigation. The techniques used by Torino's network, infiltrating construction companies, corrupting city officials, and using law enforcement assets to suppress investigation, became template for identifying similar schemes in other jurisdictions. More important, the case demonstrated that individual integrity could overcome systematic corruption when supported by federal resources and interagency cooperation. Tiffany Clark's commitment to accuracy in her work had exposed a criminal enterprise worth millions of dollars and involving dozens of officials. As 1995 began, Portland was a changed city. The corruption scandal had damaged trust, but it had also demonstrated that justice is possible when citizens and law enforcement work together to expose wrongdoing. New oversight mechanisms, transparency requirements, and integrity protocol were implemented to prevent similar corruption. Chen stood in her new office, looking out at the city she sworn to protect, and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The naive detective who'd trusted her partner completely had been replaced by someone who understood that vigilance was the price of integrity. But most importantly, Tiffany Clark was alive, free, and using her experience to fight the very corruption that had nearly... In the end, that was what made all the betrayal, danger, and uncertainty worthwhile. Justice had prevailed, but only because people of integrity had been willing to risk everything to ensure that the truth was revealed. The Clark case would be remembered not just as a corruption scandal, but as proof that individuals could make a difference when they refused to people were above the law. The nightmare that had begun with an abandoned Honda Civic in a warehouse had ended with justice, redemption, and the promise that such corruption would never again go unchallenged in Portland, Oregon.